Do you ever wonder if something too good to be true hides a secret worse than a nightmare? In the sleepy town of Ravenswood, nothing much happened. Life rolled by in the usual ways, with the same faces and the same stories repeated over coffee at Mabel's diner. That is, until the hidden hearth opened. The inn appeared overnight, no warning, no grand opening. One day, there was an empty lot on Elm Street. The next, a warm, rustic building with glowing windows and a hand-carved sign above the door, the hidden hearth. The air around it smelled of roasted herbs and fresh bread, beckoning anyone who passed by. It didn't take long for the townsfolk to gather. Free food, the handwritten chalkboard promised, for all who entered. Skepticism turned to curiosity, and curiosity gave way to hunger. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the hearth was packed. Henry Turner, a down-on-his-luck handyman, sat at one of the polished oak tables. He hadn't had a decent meal in weeks, not since the factory shut down. When the waitress, a pale woman with eyes that didn't quite meet his, placed a steaming bowl of stew in front of him, Henry didn't hesitate. The first bite was pure bliss. Warm, savory, spiced just right, it tasted like every good memory he'd ever had. But as the bowl emptied, something strange happened. Henry's face slackened. He looked around the room, confused, before quietly slipping out the door. No one noticed he was gone. Except for Claire Whitaker. Claire, a college dropout back in town to take care of her ailing mother, was always too curious for her own good. She'd seen Henry leave. More than that, she'd seen the way the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and shift toward him, as if they were alive. Something wasn't right. The next day, she went to Mabel's to ask about Henry. But no one remembered him. Not his drinking buddies, not the landlord who was always after him for rent, not even Mabel, who prided herself on knowing every soul in Ravenswood. Claire's heart raced. She went to Henry's tiny apartment on Willow Street, but it was as if he'd never lived there. His name wasn't on the mailbox. His tools were gone. Even the scuff marks on the floor where his boots used to rest had vanished. It was like he'd been erased. That night, she stood outside the hidden hearth, watching. The laughter and clinking of glasses inside seemed almost too perfect. The warm glow spilling from the windows felt unnatural, like it was trying too hard to be inviting. When she finally worked up the nerve to step inside, the same pale waitress greeted her, a smile stretching too wide. "Welcome to the hidden hearth," the woman said, her voice soft as velvet. "Table for one?" Claire nodded, her throat dry. She took a seat near the corner, her eyes darting around the room. Families, couples, and loners all sat blissfully eating, their faces serene. But there was something off about their eyes, blank, unfocused, like they were dreaming instead of awake. The waitress placed a plate in front of her, roast chicken, golden potatoes, and glistening green beans. The smell was intoxicating, but Claire didn't touch it. "Is everything to your liking?" the waitress asked, tilting her head. Claire forced a smile. "It's perfect." But her hands stayed in her lap, clenched into fists. As the night wore on, she noticed a man at another table, his hands trembling as he ate. He looked terrified, his gaze flitting to the shadows that pooled unnaturally in the corners of the room. Claire's stomach turned when she realized he wasn't eating because he wanted to. He was eating because he had to. She caught his eye, and for a moment, they understood each other. Then, the shadows moved. They slid across the floor like living things, curling around the man's chair. His fork clattered to the table as he gasped, his body stiffening. The room didn't react, no one even glanced his way. The shadows pulled him into the darkness, silent as a whisper. And just like Henry, he was gone. Claire stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Heads turned, and the pale waitress appeared at her side. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her voice smooth but with an edge that made Claire's skin crawl. Claire's mind raced. She could run, but she knew the shadows would catch her. Instead, she forced a laugh, feigning calm. "I'm not feeling well. Maybe another night." The waitress's smile didn't waver. "Of course. We'll save you a seat." Claire left without looking back, her heart pounding. Now, she knew the truth. The hidden hearth wasn't an inn, it was a trap. Every bite of food consumed a part of you, feeding something ancient and hungry that thrived on forgotten souls. But the question was, what could she do about it? She had two choices: run and save herself, or go back and stop the next victim from becoming the next course. Claire stared at the glowing sign from the safety of the shadows, the laughter from inside echoing in her ears. What would you do? Have you ever heard a sound so beautiful it made your soul shiver? That was the question Janine Graham found herself asking on the night she discovered the violin in the dusty back corner of Fowler's Antiques. The shop smelled of mildew and old wood, with trinkets and curiosities spilling from every corner like forgotten memories. She hadn't and #039 been looking for anything in particular, just passing time before her late-night piano lessons, but when her eyes caught the faint glimmer of the violin's varnish under the dim light, she felt a pull. The violin was exquisite, its body worn but sturdy, with an intricately carved scroll and strings that seemed untouched by time. A strange engraving marred the base of the neck, a spiral of small, jagged symbols that looked like a cross between sheet music and claw marks. "This one's not for sale," Mr. Fowler muttered from behind the counter, his voice gravelly as if dust had settled in his throat too. "Why not?" Janine asked, running her fingers over the polished wood. "It's cursed." She laughed, a sharp sound in the stillness of the shop. "A cursed violin? Isn't that a bit cliché?" Fowler didn't smile. He leaned forward, his pale eyes locking onto hers. "Take it home, and you'll find out. But don't say I didn't warn you." That night, Janine sat cross-legged on the floor of her apartment, the violin balanced delicately on her shoulder. She couldn't resist, the pull was too strong. As a music teacher, she had played hundreds of instruments, but none had ever felt so alive. The first note she played was soft, tentative. The sound wasn't just beautiful, it was otherworldly. It seemed to wrap itself around her, filling the room with a resonance that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She played again, a slow, mournful melody that came to her fingers as naturally as breathing. The shadows in the room flickered, as if responding to the music. Then she saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, stood at the edge of the light from her desk lamp. It wasn't solid, not exactly, but it wasn't transparent either. Its edges wavered like smoke, but its eyes burned with an unsettling intensity. Janine dropped the violin, the bow clattering to the floor. The figure didn't move. It stood there, swaying ever so slightly, as if caught in some invisible breeze. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it melted back into the darkness. She didn't sleep that night. By the next evening, curiosity overpowered fear. Janine told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of light and shadow combined with her exhaustion. She picked up the violin again, determined to prove it to herself. The moment she began to play, the figure returned. But this time, it wasn't alone. More shadows emerged, each one taller and darker than the last, their forms bending and twisting as if they were being born from the music itself. They didn't approach her, not at first. They hovered at the edges of the room, their presence suffocating, their eyes, so many eyes, fixed on her. When she stopped playing, the figures froze, then receded slightly. She realized, with a cold knot forming in her stomach, that the music brought them closer. Over the next week, Janine became obsessed. Every note she played called more figures into her apartment, and the more she played, the closer they came. They began to whisper, their voices like the rustling of dry leaves. The melodies she created were no longer her own, the violin seemed to guide her fingers, pulling forth haunting tunes that resonated with the shadows' movements. It wasn't long before the whispers turned into voices. "Keep playing, Janine. We're waiting. Bring us through." The shadows began to take on sharper forms, faces emerging from the darkness, limbs extending as if reaching for her. And then came the night when the whispers turned into screams. By the time the shadows spilled out of her apartment and into the streets, it was too late. The entire town began to feel the pull of the violin's cursed melody. People stopped in their tracks, their eyes glazing over as the music filled the air. The figures grew bolder, stepping into the light, their forms now solid and grotesque, twisted parodies of human shapes. The town streetlights flickered, then went out, plunging everything into an unnatural darkness. Janine, trembling, tried to stop playing, but her hands wouldn't obey. The violin had taken her, and the music poured out of her as if her very soul were being wrung from her body. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was a sea of shadowy figures, their eyes glowing with hunger, their hands reaching for her, for the town, for the world. And then, silence. Have you ever heard a sound so beautiful it made your soul shiver? Perhaps you have. Perhaps you've heard it already. Have you ever been sure you were alone, only to feel someone's breath on your neck? Marcus thought about that often during his late-night shifts. The rideshare gig was supposed to be temporary, just a way to keep the lights on after his photography studio went belly up. But 2 years in, he was still driving, still rolling through the dark veins of the city, ferrying strangers to destinations unknown. It was a Wednesday, the kind of quiet night when the streets whispered instead of roared. His phone pinged with a group request, 7 passengers, pick up at the corner of Finch and Langley. It was an odd number for this hour, but college kids pulling a bar crawl weren't unusual. Marcus pulled up to the curb and unlocked the doors. They piled in, laughing and reeking of tequila, filling the car with youthful noise. 7 people. He counted them, twice. The car was packed, the air thick with chatter. A guy in a faded leather jacket was telling a story about a ghost tour he'd taken last summer. "You ever seen a real ghost?" he asked Marcus from the front seat, leaning just a little too close. Marcus chuckled. "Only in the mirror after a double shift." That got a laugh from the back seat, but the guy with the leather jacket didn't laugh. His eyes held Marcus's a beat too long, something unreadable passing between them. The ride was uneventful at first. Just the kind of mundane, forgettable run Marcus preferred. They dropped off the first passenger, then another. The group thinned out until there were 3 left. Marcus glanced at the rearview mirror, absently counting heads. 1, 2, 3. And then, a 4th. The extra passenger sat in the far corner, shadowed, their face half-lit by the passing streetlights. Marcus blinked. No one had entered the car. He was sure of it. "Hey, did someone call another pickup?" he asked, his voice tight. Silence. The shadowy figure tilted its head. "I didn't call. But I was waiting." The voice was soft, almost melodic, yet it carried an unnatural weight, like a stone dropped into still water. Marcus gripped the wheel tighter. "What's your name?" "Names don't matter much, do they?" "Not tonight." The remaining passengers seemed oblivious, laughing at some joke Marcus hadn't heard. But the air in the car had changed, grown colder, heavier. The figure leaned forward just enough for Marcus to make out the shape of their face, a face that seemed familiar but wrong. Like seeing your reflection in a funhouse mirror. "I think you should pull over," the passenger said, their voice low, almost tender. "Why?" Marcus demanded, heart hammering. "Because it's easier that way. For them." And then the figure turned to the others in the car. "You first," they said, pointing to the girl in the middle seat. "Do you want to know how it happened?" "What?" she asked, startled. "Your death. It was quick, at least. A truck swerved, lost control. You didn't even have time to scream." The girl's laughter stopped. Her face went pale. "How the hell do you know about that?" she whispered. The passenger didn't answer, just turned to the guy beside her. "Yours was slower. I'm sorry about the fire. It must have hurt." Marcus felt the car veer slightly as his hands shook on the wheel. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The passenger finally looked at him, their eyes black as a starless sky. "And you, Marcus? You're the eighth. You always were." Marcus slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. He twisted in his seat, but the figure was gone. Just like that. The passengers were gone too. His car was empty. But in the silence, he heard it, the faint echo of laughter, fading into the night.